Patterns in evolution. So we're going to look at a couple of types of different patterns we would see in evolution. And the first one is divergent evolution. So generally this is looking at large-scale evolution of a group into different forms. And what this would result in is creation of a new species. This is driven by the natural selection process of disruptive natural selection, where you have the normal distribution of traits within the species, and for some reason due to the environment, the differences in those traits are being selected for. So for example, bears originated as a single group, but they have diverged into different types, and we've got different genuses of bears, different species of bears. And so something like a polar bear has particular traits that allows it to survive in its particular niche, and so they have been selected for certain traits that allow them to survive in their particular environment. Something like a white fur of a polar bear, allowing them to blend in with the snow and allowing more light to pass to their skin so they can collect more heat that way. Whereas a grizzly bear would be more brown to fit in with its environment. And so we see these different selective pressures that has disrupted a single group in the past that would at some point have had a common ancestor. It has diverged into these different types of organisms, and if it again is happening for long enough, we actually get some different species out of this. Adaptive radiation is an example of this, where we have had the species adapting and essentially radiating out. And so one way that this can happen, so I think this says divergent evolution is generally happening a little bit more quickly, and they're definitely coming from a not too distant ancestor. So if we're talking a shorter period of time, we see this happening with a geographic isolation on different islands. If a species is moving from one place to another, and then eventually moving its way back. So this first island here that had originally what was species A, they're going to be fairly quickly adapting to their environment if they're going to survive. And we have this movement back and forth between these different selectively different pressured environments for selecting for different traits. Then we can end up with a number of different species that came not too long ago from a similar species all living in the same area. The classic example of this is, of course, Darwin's finches, and this is where you have a group of islands. You have a species of bird arriving on these islands, and because of the different niches available to them in the different locations, essentially the original species would radiate out into the different species that we see today, known as the collection of Darwin species, where they all had a common ancestor, but because they have adapted for a particular niche, like say eating from a cacti versus eating insects versus eating, I don't know, what are those berries? So depending on what was available to them in their location, the ones that were better suited for those environments with the slight changes and variations would have survived. And over a period of time, if those differences are great enough, then instead of having a single species, we end up with multiple different species that have essentially radiated out from the original species. Then we have convergent evolution. And this is where we have different species with very, very different ancestors. So different, we don't even really think of their common ancestor being in the picture anymore, but where they have evolved very similar traits. So if you look at the body makeup of a shark and of a dolphin, you'd be forgiven if you're swimming around and you saw a fin sticking out, whether you were thinking it was a dolphin. No, this one's a dolphin. There we go. And this one's a shark. And so we can see that they have very similar body plans, but very, very distant ancestors. And so it is not, it's not a homologous structure that we're talking about here. We're looking at these very different species converging on a particular body plan that happens to be similar because they are trying to survive in similar niches. So essentially the environment has selected for similar traits that are from very different original sources. So we can refer to these as analogous structures are seen when we have convergent evolution. And and this ends up with a similar body shape due to the similar niche, even though they are coming from very different ancestors, so they're converging upon these similar traits, which were not in their common ancestor. And how many of these guys can you name? All 5 of them have converged on a particular means of finding food, and as this guy here, whose name would suggest, it is eating ants, and so they are all very good at reaching into tough to get places with long sticky tongues where you might find some ants and then slurping them in. I'm not sure if they all actually eat ants, but they are able to have these, they do have these long sticky tongues that can be used for collecting insects. And so this would be another example of a convergent trait, or a trait that they have converged upon, this long sticky tongue, that their common ancestor did not have, but because of the particular niches that they live in, having a long sticky tongue provides them with an advantage for that particular niche. And so they've all converged on this similar, not necessarily the entire body plan, but the idea of this one particular analogous structure. Their common ancestor would not have had a long sticky tongue, but all 5 of these have converged on that same structure. Analogous. Then we can talk coevolution. So here's where we have one species evolving in response to another species. So co-evolution, both of them are evolving together. One is being affected by the other one. And so they're both driving each other's evolutionary change. For example, leafcutter ants, not only do the relationship with the actual leaves, because the plants don't want to get eaten by the ants, so they're trying to come up with a defense mechanism because of that. But the interesting thing with them is that they bring these leaves down and they grow fungus on it. They're essentially like farmers. They farm fungus that grows on these ants. They grow on the leaves. The ants don't eat the leaves. The leaves are taken and fed to the fungus. However, there's some mold that would also like to eat this fungus, which the ants don't want because they want to eat it. And so there's actually a little patch of bacteria that grows on the top of the ant's head, which the ants use to put onto their fungus to prevent the mold from growing. So we have this really dynamic system where we have not only the plant and the ant interacting, but more importantly, the ant trying to grow this fungus, which is being attacked by the mold, but the ant uses essentially its own homegrown, or say head-grown pesticide to remove or kill off any of the mold that is trying to destroy their fungus. So the fungus is trying to evolve to be able to live in these conditions. The ant has bacteria on its head, which is trying to evolve to keep up with the fungus and trying to kill it. And so we have this co-evolution, very intricate process here between many different species, and they're all pushing and giving some pressure to each other in terms of which ways they are trying to evolve. The mold that wants to grow on the fungus is going to try to develop some resistance to the bacteria that the ants have on their head, but if the mold does develop a complete resistance and takes over, then the fungus dies, and then the ants die, and then the bacteria on the ant's head also die. So they don't want that to happen. So the bacteria are trying to keep up with an arms race and keep being able to kill the mold that is trying to kill the fungus or eat the fungus, so that their host that is keeping the bacteria, giving them a nice place to live on their head, keeping them alive. Very intricate levels of evolutionary pressure. It's all definitely connected, and that's why it's coevolution. Symbiosis is sort of a general term where we're talking about different species interacting, and then we can break that down to many different levels, but we're going to break it down only into 3. So the types of symbiosis, there is mutualism, where both of the partners benefit. That would be coevolution. So think like the bacteria and the ant. They're both co-evolving together. What's good for the bacteria, keeping the ants alive, is good for the ants as well. So they're going to work together. So that would be an example of mutualism. Antagonism, like an antagonist, this is where one of them is trying to benefit at the cost of the other one. So these are going to act as selective forces. So these are co-evolutionarily powerful types of symbiosis. Then we could look at commensalism, where essentially one of the organisms benefits and the other one isn't really affected, though it's kind of hard to say that with absolute certainty. But commensalism is generally suggesting that one of them benefits, the other one doesn't. And because of this, there's not such a selective force, so it's not really coevolution, though symbiosis is all three of these. Only mutualism and antagonism with the heavy selective force is going to be a significant factor or significant type of coevolution. So an example of a mutualistic relationship, again, this is where both are benefiting. So the classic one would be flowers. They're going to be giving nectar to the bees, and the bees are obviously benefiting because they're getting nectar to drink, but the flowers aren't doing that they're not giving them a free meal. The pollen is getting stuck on the bees, and then the pollen is taken to the next flower so that it can be used to pollinate the next flower. So the flowers get pollinated, the bees get nectar, they both win from that situation, and therefore they would end up co-evolving together. If a flower wants to attract more bees, it can make you produce more nectar, but maybe it wants to make sure that the bees only go to certain types of flowers. They might have certain structures that only a particular type of bee would fit, so they can sort of just entice that bee, so then they end up co-evolving together, and it could be to the point where one of them becomes entirely, or they both become entirely dependent on each other as a means of trying to guarantee that the bee's not going to go to some other species of flower because it's now only going to fit in this one particular flower, which is great for the flower, but it also comes at the cost that, well, if that bee then dies out, there's no other bees that may be able to fit into that flower anymore. So they do co-evolve, and sometimes it gets to extreme specialties, which means that the species may become extremely dependent on each other, whereas other ones are a little bit more generalist, where whether it's this bee or some other species of bee doesn't really matter. And so we have this diversity of levels of coevolution and how specific they are within the particular relationship. Antagonistic relationship, again, think one's benefiting, the other one's not. Lots of classic ones to this, but I mean, predator-prey is a big one, but insects eating plants, though we do have the other one. The plants don't want to be eaten by the insects, so again, they're going to try to produce some toxic chemicals, and this is maybe why certain plants don't taste very good, because they are trying not to get eaten, and so they have these particular toxic chemicals. But if you can evolve a particular means of breaking down those toxic chemicals, then you may have a very abundant food source. And so there's this back and forth co-evolution. They're both changing. In this case, they're not changing to benefit each other. One's changing to try to outwit the other one, or come in some way of being able to take advantage of that other one. And this sort of ends up with a evolutionary arms race between them. So this arms race, where one of the species develops a strategy to try to outsmart the other one, that we're not really talking about intelligence here, and then the other one, if it's going to survive, it's got to sort of match that or do better, and so we get this back and forth between them. So for example, a newt is going to try to develop some toxin so that it doesn't get eaten, but things that want to eat it are going to constantly be under the selective pressure of trying to be able to withstand those toxins. And so as the newt becomes more toxic, the predator is going to try to increase their ability to overcome those toxins. So we have this evolutionary arms race between the newt developing toxins and its predator developing the ability to withstand those toxins. Commensalism is another one where, again, one is benefiting and the other one is not, though again, that is somewhat difficult to say. Mimicry is a very common way of doing this, and so if this caterpillar looks like a snake, you would assume that would benefit the caterpillar, because if it looks like a snake, a bird may not want to eat it, or at least be scared of it to some degree, and we'd assume that this would not cost the snake that it looks like much. However, it may cost it in some degree, because if some birds figure out, oh, these are actually delicious caterpillars, not snakes, then the birds may end up attacking the snakes themselves, and so that could come at a slight cost to the snake, but not so much. So commensalism, we're assuming one of them is not significantly affected, whereas the other one would benefit greatly. So some spiders are able to do this. There's different reasons for this, lots of different types of mimicry, but ants are generally good at defending their colonies and working together as a team. Spiders are kind of alone, so if you're a little spider, you're easy prey to other bigger insects or spiders. But if you look like a ant that has a whole bunch of friends to protect it, then you yourself may be protected as well. So we have a lot of mimicry where the spider is now protected because it looks like something that has a lot of scary or a lot of friends, whereas hopefully the ants were not particularly affected by this, though there are lots of sub-levels of mimicry. All right, let's test our knowledge here. We got 3 examples, and again, any interaction is going to involve a lot of interaction, so we'll try to focus on one particular type of interaction here. There are aphids that drink on the sap from plants. So we know right there, they're taking advantage of the plant, they're drinking the plant's juice. It's not going to be good for the plant. But if we want to focus on the ants, these aphids are easy prey, another predation one, antagonistic relationship, easy prey for ladybugs. But the aphids give ants some of the delicious nectar they're getting out of the plant. They give it to the ant, and then the ant in turn protects the aphids from these ladybugs. So the aphids are giving nectar to the ant is going to protect the aphid. That is going to be a relationship where both the ant and the aphid are benefiting, so we have a commensalism relationship. Here's a classic antagonistic relationship. It's not parasitism, or sorry, it's not, there's the answer. It is parasitism, it is not predation. And this is the cuckoo bird. And so what happens is the cuckoo bird decides to outsource its parenting and lays its eggs in the nest of other birds. So here's the original mother bird of this nest here. When the cuckoo bird egg hatches out, the baby cuckoo bird is actually instinctively starts pushing all the other eggs out of the nest. So the mother ends up feeding the baby cuckoo instead, which then grows into a giant cuckoo bird, which the mother doesn't realize isn't her own offspring. And so this is very clear that the cuckoo bird is benefiting, and the mother bird has now lost her own offspring and is spending all of her energy trying to feed this giant other species of bird. So definitely one here that is an antagonistic relationship. And last of all, commensalism. So we've seen examples of these large animals that have some birds that hang around with them. The birds get led to things like water, or they get to eat some of the bugs off the animals maybe, or some of the bugs, if they're kicking up some dirt, they may get some bugs there. So assuming they're not actually eating parasites, because if they are, then that's going to be mutualistic. If they're just sort of following them around and trying to find water or eating some of the bugs that get kicked up, the elephant doesn't care that the birds are there. But the birds definitely benefit. The elephant doesn't care at all. So this is going to be one where we have one benefit and one neutral party. So we're going to have, one party here. Same thing if again, assuming we're not eating insects off of them, they're just hanging around getting a benefit, and the other large mammal doesn't care, then we're going to have a commensalistic relationship.